It was just another regular day in downtown Atlanta, the kind of day where people were rushing to get their errands done before the weekend. The sun was shining bright, and the streets were alive with the usual buzz of traffic and chatter. Elijah Johnson, a decorated Marine sniper who had served 3 tours overseas, was one of those people trying to make the most of his time off. He was on leave, visiting family after months of being away from home. Dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, he looked like any other guy running errands. Elijah had just pulled up to a red light when something unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, 2 police officers approached his car, guns drawn. Their voices were sharp and urgent as they ordered him to step out of the vehicle. Confused but calm, Elijah did what any responsible person would do. He complied. But this wasn't a routine traffic stop. The officers claimed that Elijah matched the description of a robbery suspect, a tall black man wearing a hoodie. It didn't matter that Elijah was a war hero or that he had served his country with distinction. In that moment, all they saw was someone who fit a vague description. Elijah tried to explain himself. He spoke calmly, telling them he was a Marine, on leave and showing his military ID. But instead of easing the tension, things only got worse. One of the officers accused him of being evasive, even though Elijah hadn't raised his voice or shown any sign of aggression. Before he knew it, cold metal handcuffs were around his wrists, locking him in place. For a man who had spent years protecting others, this felt surreal, like he was living someone else's nightmare. What made the situation even more painful was how public it was. Bystanders had gathered around, some recording the scene on their phones. The videos captured everything. The way Elijah stood quietly, his hands cuffed behind his back while the officers barked orders. They showed the contrast between his composed demeanor and the hostility coming from the law enforcement officials. People watching couldn't help but feel uneasy. Here was a man who had risked his life for his country, yet he was being treated like a criminal simply because of how he looked. As the minutes ticked by, Elijah's mind raced. He thought about his years in the military, the sacrifices he'd made, and the battles he'd fought both abroad and at home. Growing up, he'd faced plenty of challenges because of the color of his skin, but he'd always believed that joining the Marines would give him a sense of belonging, a chance to prove himself. Now, standing there in handcuffs, he wondered if anything had really changed. Was it possible that no matter how much he achieved, certain doors would always remain closed? The ordeal didn't end quickly. Even after confirming his identity and realizing there was no evidence linking him to the alleged crime, the officers refused to let him go immediately. Instead, they kept him detained for hours, questioning him repeatedly about his whereabouts earlier that day. Each question felt like a punch to the gut, not because they were difficult to answer, but because they implied guilt where none existed. By the time Elijah was finally released, the damage had already been done. His pride and his faith in the system had taken a serious hit. Word of the incident spread fast. Someone uploaded the bystander footage online, and within hours, it went viral. Social media platforms lit up with reactions. Some people expressed outrage, calling it an example of racial profiling. Others shared stories of similar experiences, highlighting how common such incidents were. Veterans groups were particularly vocal, demanding answers and accountability. How could a decorated Marine be treated this way? What message did this send to those who had served or were considering serving? For Elijah, the attention was overwhelming. He hadn't asked for any of this. All he wanted was to enjoy his time with family and recharge before heading back to duty. Now, his face was plastered across news outlets, and strangers were weighing in on his life. While part of him appreciated the support pouring in, another part wished he could turn back time and erase the entire incident. Unfortunately, that wasn't an option. What happened that day at the red light wasn't just a personal humiliation. It was a reflection of deeper issues that needed to be addressed. And so, as Elijah sat at home replaying the events in his mind, he realized something important. This wasn't just about him anymore. Whether he liked it or not, his story had become a symbol, a reminder of the work still needed to bridge divides and ensure fairness for everyone. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would test his strength, resilience, and belief in justice. The video of Elijah's arrest spread like wildfire. Within hours, it seemed like everyone had seen it. Social media platforms were flooded with reactions, some angry, some heartbroken, and some simply stunned. For many, the footage was hard to watch. It wasn't just the sight of a decorated Marine in handcuffs that shocked people. It was the way he carried himself throughout the ordeal. Elijah's calmness stood out sharply against the aggression of the officers. His quiet dignity made the injustice feel even more raw. People began sharing their own stories online. Veterans from all branches of the military chimed in, recounting times when they'd been treated unfairly because of their race or appearance. One former soldier posted about being stopped multiple times while wearing his uniform, despite proudly serving for over a decade. A retired Navy officer shared how her son, also a service member, had once been questioned at gunpoint during a routine traffic stop. These stories poured in from every corner of the country, painting a picture of a problem far bigger than Elijah's individual case. Civil rights organizations quickly joined the conversation. Leaders from groups dedicated to fighting racial injustice held press conferences, calling Elijah's treatment unacceptable and demanding accountability. They pointed out that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern where Black individuals, regardless of their achievements or contributions, were disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. The hashtag #CheerJusticeForElijah started trending, drawing attention not only to his story but also to countless others who had faced similar situations without the same level of public support. Elijah's family was overwhelmed by the outpouring of solidarity. His mother, a soft-spoken woman who had raised him on her own, became one of his fiercest advocates. She spoke openly about the pride she felt seeing her son serve his country, only to have him treated like a suspect in his own neighborhood. Her words resonated deeply with viewers, humanizing Elijah beyond the viral video. "He's not just a Marine," she said in an interview. "He's my baby boy. He deserves respect." Meanwhile, Elijah's legal team got to work. With the help of civil rights attorneys and pro bono lawyers from veteran advocacy groups, they filed a formal complaint against the police department. The goal wasn't just to clear Elijah's name, it was to push for systemic change. They argued that what happened wasn't just a mistake. It was symptomatic of broader issues within law enforcement that needed urgent attention. As the case gained traction, pressure mounted on local officials to take action. But the scrutiny didn't stop there. Members of Congress took notice too. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle condemned the incident, using Elijah's story as a rallying cry for reform. Some called for investigations into racial profiling practices, while others proposed legislation aimed at protecting veterans and active duty personnel from unjust treatment. Elijah's case had struck a nerve, sparking a national conversation about fairness, respect, and the value we place on those who serve. Amid all the noise, Elijah tried to stay grounded. He leaned heavily on his faith and the support of his loved ones. Friends and fellow Marines reached out constantly, offering encouragement and vowing to stand by him no matter what. Many of them expressed outrage on his behalf, unable to fathom why one of their own had been treated this way. Some even offered to testify if the case went to court, ready to speak up about Elijah's character and commitment to duty. One person who reached out was a high-ranking official in the Marine Corps, a four-star general known for championing the rights of service members. When he heard about what had happened to Elijah, he didn't hesitate to get involved. For him, this wasn't just about one Marine. It was about sending a message. Service members put their lives on the line for their country, and they deserve to be treated with dignity when they come home. The general knew he had to do something meaningful, not just for Elijah, but for everyone who might find themselves in a similar situation down the line. As the days turned into weeks, Elijah found himself torn between gratitude and frustration. On one hand, he was thankful for the overwhelming support. It reminded him that he wasn't alone, that there were people who cared deeply about justice and equality. On the other hand, He couldn't shake the feeling that none of this should have happened in the first place. He hadn't asked to become the face of a movement. He just wanted to live his life without having to constantly prove his worth. Despite the challenges, Elijah refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, he focused on finding purpose in the chaos. If his story could shine a light on the struggles faced by so many, then maybe something good could come out of it. He began thinking about ways to use his platform to make a difference, even as he prepared for the possibility of facing charges. Whatever lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't back down. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. And so, as the world waited to see what would happen next, Elijah braced himself for the fight of his life. Little did he know, the courtroom drama was about to take a turn no one expected. But through it all, one thing remained clear. Elijah's courage and resilience were inspiring others to demand better, from the system, from society, and from themselves. The courtroom was packed to the brim on the day Elijah's case began. Reporters with notepads and cameras filled the back rows, while supporters from the veteran community sat closer to the front, their uniforms a quiet but powerful statement of solidarity. The air was thick with tension, a mix of anticipation and unease. Everyone knew this wasn't just about one man, it was about something much bigger. For Elijah, though, it felt deeply personal. This was his life on display, his character under scrutiny and his future hanging in the balance. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The prosecutor stood up first, laying out their case. They argued that Elijah matched the vague description of a robbery suspect, a tall black man wearing a hoodie, and pointed to conflicting witness statements as evidence. It didn't matter that no physical evidence tied him to the crime or that his alibi checked out. In their eyes, the fact that someone thought they saw him near the scene was enough to bring charges. As the prosecutor spoke, Elijah sat stoically, his face unreadable. But inside, he was boiling. How could they twist the truth like this? How? Could they ignore the facts? Elijah's lawyer countered with precision, presenting documents that proved his client's innocence. They showed records of where Elijah had been at the time of the alleged crime, visiting a local store, confirmed by security footage, and highlighted his impeccable military record. The lawyer emphasized the absurdity of prosecuting a decorated Marine based on flimsy evidence and racial profiling. "We're here today because of assumptions," the lawyer said, his voice steady but firm. "Assumptions that have no place in our justice system." But even as the defense made its case, Elijah couldn't help but feel uneasy. He noticed the way some jurors looked at him, not with curiosity or empathy, but with suspicion. It was subtle, but it was there. Their eyes lingered a little too long, their expressions a little too guarded. It reminded him of the same looks he'd gotten during the arrest, the ones that said, "Prove you're not guilty." The weight of those stares pressed down on him, heavier than any handcuffs ever could. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Honor our heroes and justice for all." Some chanted slogans, their voices echoing through the streets, while others stood quietly, heads bowed in prayer. Among them were veterans who had served alongside Elijah, people who knew him not just as a Marine but as a friend. One older man, a retired sergeant with graying hair and a weathered face, told reporters, "I've seen what this man is capable of. He saved lives, and now we're sitting here watching him fight for his own." Inside, the trial continued. Witnesses were called to testify, including the officers who had arrested Elijah. Under cross-examination, cracks began to show in their story. When asked why they hadn't verified Elijah's identity before detaining him, one officer hesitated, then mumbled something about protocol. Another admitted they hadn't reviewed the security footage until days later, despite knowing it existed. These inconsistencies fueled the defense's argument that the arrest had been rushed and based on bias rather than facts. As the hearing dragged on, Elijah found himself reflecting on the irony of it all. Here he was, a sniper known for his precision and discipline, reduced to defending himself against baseless accusations. In the field, he had always relied on logic and evidence Two things that seemed strangely absent in this courtroom. He thought about the countless hours he'd spent honing his skills, the sacrifices he'd made, and the risks he'd taken to protect others. And yet, none of that mattered here. Not really. By the end of the day, exhaustion settled over everyone. The judge announced a recess, giving both sides time to prepare for the next phase of the trial. As Elijah walked out of the courthouse surrounded by his legal team and supporters, he was greeted by cheers from the crowd outside. Strangers reached out to shake his hand, offering words of encouragement. A young woman handed him a folded piece of paper. Inside was a simple message: "Stay strong, we believe in you." That night, Elijah lay awake, replaying the events of the day in his mind. He thought about the prosecutor's arguments, the jurors' faces, and the sea of supporters outside. He thought about how far he'd come, from growing up in a tough neighborhood to earning respect as a Marine, and how quickly it had all been called into question. Despite the frustration and fatigue, he felt a flicker of determination. If nothing else, this trial would force people to confront uncomfortable truths. Maybe, just maybe, it could lead to change. The next morning, as Elijah prepared to return to court, he received a phone call that would alter the course of everything. On the other end of the line was someone whose voice carried authority and weight. It was a high-ranking official from the Marine Corps, someone Elijah had never met but whose reputation preceded them. The caller explained that they were coming to the courtroom, not as a spectator, but as a participant. They wanted to ensure that Elijah's service and sacrifice weren't forgotten in the midst of legal wrangling. For Elijah, the news brought a mix of emotions. Relief because it meant he wouldn't be fighting alone anymore. Gratitude because someone in power cared enough to step in. And a touch of apprehension because he knew the stakes were higher now. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't just affect him. It would send a message to every service member, every veteran, and every person who believed in fairness and justice. As Elijah stepped into the courtroom the following day, he noticed a shift in the energy. The crowd seemed larger, the tension thicker. Reporters whispered among themselves, speculating about what might happen. Even the judge appeared more attentive than usual. Then the doors opened, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. What came next would leave an indelible mark on everyone present and set the stage for a moment of reckoning that no one saw coming. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation when the doors swung open. Everyone turned their heads, craning to see who had entered. At first, it seemed like just another routine moment in the trial. But then a figure appeared who commanded instant attention. A 4-star general from the Marine Corps walked in, his presence undeniable. He wasn't dressed casually. He wore his full uniform, adorned with medals that told stories of decades of service. The room fell silent as he moved toward the front, his steps deliberate and measured. Elijah froze for a second, unsure of what to make of this unexpected arrival. His lawyer gave him a reassuring glance, but even they seemed caught off guard. No one had anticipated this level of involvement from someone so high-ranking. The general didn't stop at the gallery where spectators usually sat. Instead, he approached the judge's bench, requesting permission to address the court. The judge nodded, curiosity etched on their face, and gestured for the general to speak. Standing before the packed courtroom, the general took a deep breath. His voice carried authority, but there was also warmth in it, a tone that made people listen closely. "Your Honor," he began, "I am here today not only as a representative of the United States Marine Corps, but as someone who has served alongside men and women like the defendant sitting before you." He paused, letting his words sink in. What happened to this Marine is not just an individual injustice. It is a reflection of how we treat those who have given everything to protect us. He went on to describe Elijah's record in vivid detail, painting a picture of a man whose courage and skill were unmatched. He talked about the missions Elijah had been part of, the lives he had saved, and the sacrifices he had made. "This man has stared danger in the face countless times," the general said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "He has risked his life for our freedom, yet here he stands accused because of assumptions based on how he looks." The courtroom was spellbound. Even the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in their seat. The general's words weren't accusatory or angry. They were measured and respectful, but they carried undeniable weight. He reminded everyone that the military wasn't perfect, but it prided itself on values like honor, integrity, and accountability. Treating a decorated veteran this way undermined those principles. Then he turned to face the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, locking eyes with each member, "you hold the power to send a message not just to this courtroom but to the entire nation. What kind of society do we want to be? One that judges people based on stereotypes, or one that honors their contributions and treats them fairly?" For Elijah, hearing these words felt surreal. He had spent years proving himself in the military, earning respect through hard work and dedication. Yet here was someone else, someone far above his rank, standing up for him in a way he never imagined possible. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about restoring faith in the system. As the general spoke, Elijah felt a lump form in his throat. For the first time since the arrest, he allowed himself to feel hope. When the general finished speaking, the courtroom erupted into murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks while some members of the audience wiped tears from their eyes. Outside, news crews scrambled to capture reactions from protesters and supporters alike. Word spread quickly. A top official from the Marine Corps had personally intervened in Elijah's case. Social media lit up again, with hashtags like "Respect Our Troops" trending within minutes. Back inside, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The prosecution team huddled together, whispering urgently. They knew they were fighting an uphill battle now. How could they justify pressing charges against a man whose character had just been vouched for by one of the highest-ranking officials in the military? The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful. You could almost see the gears turning in their minds as they processed what they had just heard. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lead prosecutor stood up. Their demeanor was different now, less confident, more hesitant. Clearing their throat, they addressed the judge. "Your Honor," they said, "after careful consideration and in light of new information presented today, we are withdrawing all charges against the defendant." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some people clapped instinctively before remembering where they were and quickly quieting down. The judge nodded solemnly, announcing the decision officially. "All charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed," they declared, banging the gavel with finality. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, people began to rise to their feet. Elijah's family rushed forward, embracing him tightly. His mother sobbed openly, repeating over and over, "My baby's free." Friends and fellow Marines patted him on the back, offering congratulations and words of support. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers. Protesters who had gathered earlier hugged each other, celebrating the victory. Cameras flashed as Elijah stepped out of the courthouse, flanked by his attorney and the general. Reporters shouted questions, but Elijah simply smiled. A small, tired smile, and raised a hand in gratitude. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes said it all. Later that evening, Elijah sat alone in his hotel room, replaying the day's events in his mind. He thought about the general's speech, the jurors' reactions, and the sea of faces cheering for him outside. He thought about how close he had come to being convicted of something he didn't do. And he thought about the thousands of others who might not have been as lucky as him. People without uniforms, without medals, without someone powerful enough to step in and demand justice. Despite the outcome, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't truly over. Yes, the charges had been dropped, but the underlying issues remained. Racial profiling, bias in law enforcement, and systemic inequality weren't problems that could be solved overnight. Still, he allowed himself a moment of peace. For now, he was free, and maybe, just maybe, his story would inspire others to keep pushing for change. As he drifted off to sleep, exhausted but hopeful, Elijah realized something important. This wasn't just his victory. It belonged to everyone who had stood with him, from his family to his fellow Marines, From civil rights advocates to strangers holding signs on the street, they had all played a role in bringing him this far. And in that unity, he found strength. The dismissal of charges was a huge relief for Elijah, but it didn't magically erase the weight of everything he had been through. Walking out of that courthouse with his head held high felt like a victory, sure, but it also left him with a lot to process. The cheers from the crowd outside were overwhelming, and while he appreciated the support, he couldn't help but feel conflicted. Yes, justice had been served in this case, but what about everyone else who didn't have someone as powerful as a 4-star general stepping in to fight for them? What about the countless others who faced similar situations without cameras rolling or hashtags trending? In the days following the trial, Elijah found himself reflecting on the bigger picture. He started receiving invitations to speak at events, community rallies, veterans gatherings, even conferences focused on criminal justice reform. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he enjoyed, and the thought of putting himself back in the spotlight made him uneasy. But then he remembered the faces of the people outside the courthouse, the protesters holding signs, the families sharing their own stories, the veterans nodding in solidarity. They weren't just cheering for him. They were cheering for change. And if his voice could help push that forward, how could he say no? His first speech was nerve-wracking. Standing in front of a packed auditorium, Elijah gripped the microphone tightly, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. "I never asked for any of this," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "All I wanted was to live my life, serve my country, and come home to my family without having to prove my worth every single time." The room went silent, every eye fixed on him. He talked about the arrest, the trial, and the role the Marine Corps and the general had played in clearing his name. But more importantly, he spoke about the lessons he'd learned along the way. "I realized something during all of this," Elijah said, pausing to look out at the audience. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. We can't keep pretending these things don't happen. We can't keep turning a blind eye to the biases and inequalities that exist in our society. Because when we do, we're not just failing individuals, we're failing ourselves as a community." By the end of his speech, the crowd erupted into applause. People lined up to shake his hand, thanking him for being brave enough to share his story. Some shared their own experiences, telling him how much his words resonated with them. Others simply hugged him, tears streaming down their faces. For Elijah, those moments were humbling. He hadn't set out to become a symbol of resilience or a voice for change, but now that he was here, he knew he couldn't walk away. Meanwhile, the fallout from the trial continued to ripple outward. Lawmakers introduced new legislation aimed at addressing racial profiling within law enforcement. Police departments across the country began implementing training programs designed to combat implicit bias, many of which were co-developed by veterans organizations. Civil rights groups used Elijah's case as a rallying cry, pushing for greater accountability and transparency in the justice system. Even the prosecutor who had initially pressed charges issued a public apology, acknowledging the flaws in their investigation and pledging to do better moving forward. But perhaps the most significant impact came from within the military itself. The 4-star general who had stepped into the courtroom didn't stop advocating after the trial ended. Inspired by Elijah's courage, the general worked tirelessly to ensure that service members would be protected from similar incidents in the future. New policies were proposed, requiring law enforcement agencies to verify identities thoroughly before detaining active duty personnel or veterans. Training modules were developed to educate officers about the unique challenges faced by military members, emphasizing the importance of treating them with dignity and respect. For Elijah, seeing these changes unfold gave him a sense of purpose. Knowing that his ordeal might prevent others from going through the same thing made the pain feel a little less heavy. Still, he remained grounded. He knew progress wouldn't happen overnight, and there would always be setbacks. But he also believed in the power of persistence. If enough people kept speaking up, kept demanding better, real change was possible. As weeks turned into months, Elijah returned to his duties as a sniper instructor. Teaching young recruits became his anchor, a way to channel his energy into something positive. He didn't sugarcoat the realities of serving in the military. He told them about the sacrifices, the hardships, and yes, the injustices they might face. But he also reminded them of their strength. "You joined this because you wanted to make a difference," he often said during training sessions. "Don't let anyone take that away from you. Stand tall, stay true to yourself, and remember why you started." His students admired him, not just for his skills but for his character. Many of them had followed his story in the news and were inspired by how he handled adversity. One recruit, a young woman fresh out of boot camp, approached him after class one day. "Sir," she said shyly, "thank you for everything you've done, not just for standing up for yourself, but for showing us that we can too." Her words stayed with Elijah long after she walked away. In that moment, he realized his influence extended far beyond the courtroom. Outside of work, Elijah continued to advocate for reform. He partnered with civil rights organizations, lending his voice to campaigns focused on ending racial profiling and promoting fairness in the justice system. He traveled to different cities, meeting with activists, lawmakers, and community leaders. Each conversation reinforced his belief that change was possible, even if it required patience and perseverance. One evening, while attending a panel discussion on systemic inequality, Elijah found himself seated next to the four-star general who had stepped into his trial. The two exchanged smiles, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had been on together. After the event, they sat down over coffee, talking about the road ahead. "You know," the general said, stirring his cup thoughtfully, "you've accomplished something incredible. You've shown people that even in the darkest moments there's hope." Elijah nodded, absorbing the compliment but quick to deflect. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "If it weren't for folks like you, none of this would have happened. This is about teamwork, sir, about standing together and refusing to back down." The general chuckled softly. "Well said, Marine. Well said." As the night wore on, Elijah reflected on how far he'd come since that fateful day at the red light. The scars of the experience would always remain, but so would the lessons he'd learned. He understood now that justice wasn't something you achieved alone. It was something you fought for collectively. And while the fight was far from over, he felt ready to keep pushing forward, one step at a time. Because in the end, it wasn't just about clearing his name or winning a legal battle. It was about creating a world where no one had to go through what he did. A world where honor, respect, and equality weren't ideals reserved for speeches, but realities lived by everyone. Months had passed since the trial, and Elijah was back where he belonged, on the training grounds mentoring young recruits. The sun beat down on the dusty field as he watched his students practice their aim. They were eager, determined, and full of questions. Some wanted to know about his time overseas. Others were curious about the trial and how he handled the pressure. Elijah answered honestly, but always steered the conversation toward what mattered most: resilience. "Life's gonna throw challenges at you," he'd say, leaning casually against a wooden post. "But it's not about avoiding them. It's about how you rise after you fall." Despite returning to his routine, Elijah couldn't help but notice how much things had changed, for him and for those around him. His story had become a beacon of hope for many. Veterans who once felt invisible now reached out to share their struggles, knowing they weren't alone. Families dealing with similar injustices found strength in his example, using his case as a blueprint for seeking justice in their own lives. Even strangers sent letters or messages online, thanking him for inspiring them to keep fighting, no matter how hard life got. One day, while sorting through a stack of mail, Elijah came across a letter that stopped him in his tracks. It was from a young boy, barely 10 years old, whose father, a Marine, had been wrongfully detained during a traffic stop months earlier. The boy wrote about how scared he had been when police officers took his dad away, and how reading about Elijah gave him hope that things could get better. "My dad says you're a hero," the note read. "I think so too." Elijah stared at the words for a long time, feeling both humbled and heartbroken. He knew then that his fight wasn't just about policy changes or courtroom victories. It was about giving people like this little boy something to believe in. The impact of Elijah's story extended beyond individual lives and into institutions. Lawmakers continued working tirelessly to pass legislation aimed at protecting veterans and active duty personnel from racial profiling. Police departments adopted new protocols designed to prevent rushed arrests based on vague descriptions. Training programs emphasized empathy and accountability, teaching officers to see individuals, not stereotypes. These reforms didn't happen overnight, but they marked important steps toward progress. And every step forward was a testament to the collective effort of countless people who refused to stay silent. Elijah remained deeply involved in these efforts, attending meetings, testifying before Congress, and collaborating with advocacy groups. But he also made sure to carve out time for himself and his loved ones. Spending hours on the phone with his mom became a regular habit again. She often reminded him to take care of his mental health, urging him not to let bitterness creep in. "You've already done so much good, baby," she'd tell him. "Don't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Her words grounded him, reminding him that even heroes need rest. His relationships with fellow Marines grew stronger too. Many of them had rallied around him during the trial, and now they stayed connected, sharing updates and supporting each other through personal and professional challenges. One evening, over beers and laughter, one of his closest friends raised a toast. "To Elijah," he said, grinning, "for showing us what real leadership looks like, not just on the battlefield, but off it too." The group erupted into cheers, clinking glasses under the starry sky. For Elijah, moments like these were priceless. They reminded him that he wasn't just part of a team, he was part of a family. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, lying awake in bed, Elijah would replay the events leading up to his arrest. He thought about the fear he'd felt, the humiliation of being handcuffed in broad daylight, and the frustration of having to prove his innocence. Those memories lingered, sharp and vivid, but they no longer controlled him. Instead, they fueled his determination to create a future where no one else had to endure the same pain. "Progress isn't perfect," he reminded himself, "but it's worth fighting for." As the months turned into a year, Elijah began noticing subtle shifts in society. Conversations about racial profiling and systemic inequality were happening more openly, not just in activist circles but in schools, workplaces, and homes. People were starting to listen, to really listen, to stories like his. Social media campaigns highlighting injustices gained traction, putting pressure on policymakers to act. Even within law enforcement, some officers began speaking out, acknowledging the need for change and working alongside advocates to make it happen. Elijah's role evolved along with the movement. While he still spoke at events and participated in reform initiatives, he also focused on mentoring young people. He partnered with organizations that supported kids from underserved communities, encouraging them to pursue education, careers, and dreams, without letting obstacles hold them back. "You don't have to be defined by your circumstances," he told a group of high school students during one visit. "Your potential is limitless if you believe in yourself and surround yourself with people who believe in you too." By the end of the year, Elijah received an unexpected invitation to speak at a national conference honoring service members and civil rights leaders. When he stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause. Veterans saluted him, activists cheered, and families held up signs bearing messages of gratitude. As he looked out at the sea of faces, Elijah felt a surge of emotion. This wasn't just recognition, it was validation. Validation that his voice mattered, that his story resonated, and that his fight had sparked something bigger than himself. In his speech, Elijah reflected on everything he'd learned over the past year. Change doesn't come from waiting for someone else to fix things, he said, his voice steady and clear. It comes from standing up, speaking out, and refusing to settle for less than what's right. None of us can do it alone. We need each other. We need courage, compassion, and commitment, and we need to remember why we started. When he finished speaking, The room was silent for a moment before erupting into thunderous applause. People lined up afterward to thank him, some shaking his hand, others hugging him tightly. Among them was the four-star general who had stood by him during the trial. The two exchanged a warm handshake, followed by a brief embrace. "You've done incredible work," the general said, smiling. "Keep going. You're making a difference." As Elijah walked away from the event, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks. But he knew he wasn't walking it alone. Behind him was a community of supporters, veterans, activists, lawmakers, and everyday people, all united by a shared vision of a fairer, kinder world. Ahead of him lay opportunities to continue shaping that world, one small step at a time. And so, Elijah carried on, balancing his roles as a Marine, a mentor, and an advocate. He didn't see himself as extraordinary, just someone doing what needed to be done. But to everyone else, he was proof that even in the face of injustice, hope could prevail. His story wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. About turning pain into purpose, struggle into strength, and individual triumphs into collective victories. In the end, that was what made Elijah's journey unforgettable, not just for him, but for everyone fortunate enough to witness it.